Well, thank you for downloading this DSEI panel discussion. The opening session of DSEI 2021 will be in 431 days' time, and it's going to offer an unrivaled opportunity for those engaged in the defence and security enterprise to meet and engage with each other. In these last few months, following scientific advice has perhaps taken a whole new meaning. And technology has been exploited in ways that many have been advocating for years, but it's taken a crisis to force changes in human behaviour to get it truly adopted. One of those changes is our markedly increased use of virtual means, such as this webinar, to engage with each other. So thank you, the audience, for engaging with us. I'm sure that you'll all feel at the end of this discussion a desire to engage with our panelists further. But of course, one of the limitations of the physical world is our inability to have those vital sidebar conversations, to go up and buttonhole somebody and just have a chat. But in 431 days' time, there will be an opportunity to once again have those serendipitous meetings and sidebar conversations, which I'm greatly looking forward to. Now, our discussion this morning is on one of the hottest topics in the world of defence and security. How will science and technology shape our immediate and medium-term futures? In 1993, the popular futurologist Alvin Toffler, who's probably forgotten by most now, further developed his thesis on the third wave of human development and wrote War and Anti-War. He postulated that the first, agrarian, and second, industrial waves of development were about to be dwarfed by the third wave, an information wave, and this would have a pervasive influence on the future of conflict. And perhaps we may or may not be on the cusp of that third wave in conflict. The challenge Toffler and all those looking to the future have is in seeing how existing organizations and technologies will influence and be influenced by newer technologies and scientific discoveries, and how these in turn will shape human behavior. Now, I've not asked this morning's panelists to focus on the latter outcome, as much of that lies in the realm of politics and military organizations. But we will be focusing on the roles of how fundamental and applied scientific research and technological development will serve defence over the next 10 years. And we could not have wished for a better panel to discuss this than those that I'm joined by now. So welcome, Gary Aitkenhead, Chief Scientist of MOD's Defence and Scientific Technological Laboratory, Dr. Bryan Wells, Chief Scientist of NATO, and Dr. David Snelling, the Programme Director for Artificial Intelligence with Fujitsu. Gentlemen, you're most welcome and thank you for joining us. Now, I'm not going to embarrass my guests by reading their detailed records of achievement, otherwise known as their biographies, but these are available on the website, as is the other supporting material that we'll touch on in the course of our discussion. So, Gary, can I perhaps turn to you first and ask you to outline what you think are the key developments that you see in the coming decade?
Well, thank you very much, Simon, and hello to everyone watching online. It's a real pleasure to be with you this morning, and I represent Defence Science and Technology Lab. I'm the Chief Executive there. Briefly, DSTL is 4,500 predominantly scientists and engineers that have a long history of actually leading defence applied research and providing many of the cutting edge military capabilities that we see in service today. We're very focused on the future, and the world at this time makes that even more challenging than it has been in the previous decades. We've got a very broad expertise across all areas of science and technology that you can possibly imagine, and very active and healthy relationships with UK industry, large and small universities, and international partners across the world. So the challenges are many, and the first of these is driven by the pace of change of technology, especially over the last 10 or 15 years. Technology is evolving at exponential pace. And I think everybody in the world, whether you're in technology or not, can see that through many of the, the technological advancements such as the smartphone and telecommunications, and actually this very video online capability that we're using here today. And it's moving at exponential pace. The second kind of key challenge is the threat landscape. And if you think about how not so long ago we talked about the Cold War, moving to counter-terrorism, moving today talking about sub-threshold conflict and global competition, that's also changing quite rapidly. And on top of that, prior to this pandemic, we all talked about climate change as probably being the challenge of our generation and our children's generation. And now layer on top what we've seen with a pandemic that we're still in the middle of. You put all of that together and you think, my goodness, the complexity of the challenge, the threat landscape, together with the pace of change of technology just kind of multiplies to create a very, very complex world. But there is, I think, one thing that's for sure in among all of this complexity, that our ability as a nation and as a community to harness the capability and the promise of what science and technology can offer, is absolutely fundamental and directly linked to our national defense and security, as well as our ability to compete globally within this very complex environment. So the questions that we're going to talk about today are absolutely fundamental, as I say, not just to our national security, but I think to our ability to compete in a global stage in a rapidly changing and ever complex environment.
Thanks, Gary. Great start. And I'm going to turn to Bryan Wells from NATO. And Bryan, I'm going to give you the difficult challenge of summarising in 2 to 3 minutes the 160 pages of the NATO Science and Technology Trends document, which you've recently published. It's been recently published and probably contains all the answers. But if you could summarise that 160 pages in 2 to 3 minutes for the audience, that would be wonderful. But I'm not sure that's a safe challenge. Bryan.
Simon, thanks very much. I will do my best to answer that challenge. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen, dear colleagues. I'm Bryan Wells, NATO Chief Scientist. My job is to deliver scientific advice to NATO leadership in the headquarters in Brussels, and also to chair the NATO Science and Technology Board, which is composed of the research and technology directors of the allied nations. The key to our success is that I can reach back into a network of over 6,000 scientists from the nations, both government scientists, academia and industry, prime contractors as well as SMEs. At any one time, our programme is about £300 million per annum, which is amongst the highest of any single NATO ally. In terms of what NATO thinks the key technologies are going to be, in April of this year, my office of Chief Scientist published Science and Technology Trends 2020 to 2040. It's a detailed document. It's available to download with the package of this webinar. In sum, I'd just like to make 3 points, not at individual technologies, but 3 overarching points. The first is the document sets out that it's rarely individual technologies that make the difference, but it's combinations of technologies. We often join AI with big data, for example, but we believe that the characteristics of disruptive technologies when joined together are really fourfold. We will find technologies that are intelligent, interconnected, distributed, and digital. Those are the 4 characteristics that we highlight. So we can think of AI, big data, autonomy, We're already seeing these as moving forward, as key, as maturing today. And we judge that these are the key areas to be looking at in the near term. So in terms of timescales, my second point, in the short term, in 5 to 10 years, the report identifies AI, big data, autonomy, and adds also space and hypersonics as areas which in the plannable near term will be maturing and delivering capabilities. Beyond that, in the 10 to 20 years timescale, we will be seeing biotechnology and quantum increasingly coming on into maturity. We drafted this report before COVID-19 became an issue. Whether as a result of that biotechnology may now be accelerating at a more rapid pace, we will certainly see. So having looked at the combination of technologies, the timescales, I'd just like to pick up one point that Gary made about the pace of technology. I absolutely agree, and I won't add to that, but in addition to pace, there's also the breadth of technologies. Technologies are just getting more and more developed. We're looking at more of them. That's a challenge. We need to be very good at prioritizing. We've got very good horizon scanning tools to do that. But I would also argue that it's an opportunity. It gives leadership choices about what sort of technologies to use in the future. We know that some technologies can give rise to ethical and moral issues, and leaders can genuinely exercise choices in that. So in summary, those are the three areas that the Technology Trends Report highlights. All of our judgments, of course, are open to professional challenge. That's part of the dialogue that we're very interested in having, but those are NATO's judgments. Thank you, Simon.
Thanks, Brian. And Dave, to you, I think some of this will be music to your ears as the Director of Artificial Intelligence, since it's already played quite a role in our the beginnings of our conversation here. But more broadly, how do you see the next decade with industry and its influence in developing those technologies? Because both Gary and Brian have spoken about actually how the military, the sort of government-led initiatives are no longer in charge. It's actually vested in the civil sector.
Yeah, so thank you all for letting me join. I'm pleased to be here today. And Fujitsu is just a little bit on myself first. I work, as I said, the AI director for Northwest Europe's artificial intelligence, but also have a seat in the CTO office of our defense business. And Fujitsu is better known, I think, in the defense business for keeping the lights on, or more importantly, getting them back on when they go off again. And so the idea of innovation and cutting edge technology is not one for which we are known. But as a corporation back about 80 years, we actually have been a core to a lot of the significant technology developments, from things like the high electron mobility transistor that enables all of the radar today is very much a core Fujitsu technology. What I'm working on at the moment mostly really ties into what's in the report that Brian's published, that I think is really excellent, is that notion of the timescales and understanding what is ready now versus what is to come, to what is, please don't think about it yet, guys, because you're going to waste your time kind of thing. Yeah. So with my future technologies hat on, I'm the reference point for our quantum technologies or a quantum inspired technologies work. And in that space, the report outlines that the idea of quantum computing is the farthest one down the road. And I think that is really important for, particularly for the defense sector, not to be distracted by the quantum computing, because there's plenty of stuff we're doing. Yes, the cryptography issue is critical, but there are ways around it that don't involve quantum computing. You don't even have to have quantum key exchange to get away with it. But the other quantum technologies, particularly around quantum sensing and quantum imaging, are much more closer to real time. Okay, they're sort of TRL 3 and 4 rather than 1 and 2. Okay, where quantum computing sits. But the other thing that ties in is the interaction of the technologies, and I'm fully supportive of that. And you mentioned AI and data being key. One of the key things about the information is, I think you touched on it as well, is it being distributed. And so a whole lot of what enables technology to work together, particularly when you take two novel technologies together, is that bread and butter wiring that allows you to actually bring the technologies together. So the ability to capture high quality information through deployed sensors, transmit it through, say, private 5G networks, get it into trusted data stores, do the data cleansing, huge task, particularly on field data, and then turn that into something that's usable through whatever kind of advanced technologies you have. It is one of the really critical points that we're looking forward to supporting. There are a few highlights along the way, but we'll probably come to those as we get further into it. So just very glad to be here, and then let's continue our conversation.
I think that's a really great intro, Dave, because you've highlighted that that we can get really very excited about certain technologies that just aren't ready, and actually that can lead us to perhaps be blinded to some other technologies which are coming up, which will be the ones that make that transformative change. And thank you for highlighting the transistor as being one of those things that we just tend to forget about, that actually our sort of silicon-based technologies owe their origins to a very simple, well, quite a complicated development, but actually of a very simple thing. And that came out of fundamental research. Before we sort of get into some of the prioritization and other questions, can I ask you guys a question in terms of that fundamental research in materials, in the physics, the chemistry, and the biologies that are out there? Are we doing enough in that area? And can you see trends in there that may influence the future? Perhaps I'll come first to you, Bryan, from a sort of NATO perspective. What do you see in that sort of fundamental research as you look across the alliance? And then perhaps I'll come to you, Gary, from a UK perspective, and Dave, then from your industry hat, but also having come from academia and having that academic relationship. Bryan.
Simon, thank you. I'd like to make 2 points around this. The first is when we look at the strengths of the countries of the NATO alliance in terms of science and technology, what is really striking is how good our academic base is. 9 of the 10 top universities in the world are on the soil of NATO allies. So if we are to maintain our technological edge, we need to keep that academic base strong and thriving. We need to ensure that the scientists coming through into the government laboratories, into industry, and those who stay in academia retain their global excellence. So that is absolutely vital that we maintain this support level. In terms of are we missing any science? I think it's really important that people in my position and Simon and David focus not only on the new groundbreaking technologies, but also on the technologies that the military need, but which might not be transformative in the same way. Our job is to make sure our armed forces have the technological edge. That is in both disruptive technologies, but it's in more traditional technologies that are improving in a more traditional way. So those are the 2 points I'd like to highlight. We need to maintain our academic excellence, and we need to cover the full range of technologies that will be needed for military purposes in the future. Thank you.
I mean, Gary, every sort of, the technology that pops into my head when I think about revolutionary developments is graphene as in terms of a material development. And there was an enormous amount of hype around it, and then it's all gone quiet. I mean, I'm sure there's lots of work going on, but from your perspective, from as you look at the UK landscape in that fundamental research, is there something out there that you're seeing that gives you hope that actually we are going to find those disruptive technologies that Bryan highlighted, that pulls through from that fundamental science?
Yeah, I think there's lots of things, and I think about this kind of like a pipeline of technology maturation up through the TRL levels, if you like, and at the low end, pure research and a thriving university sector and investment in that. And I think the UK does a good job on this. The substantial investment primarily through UKRI into universities that really address that kind of pure research end of the scale, and then moving up into more applied research is where we start to kind of get involved. And the technology scanning that Bryan mentioned is really important, to be kind of looking around and seeing what's out there and thinking, oh, there's one that actually might be worth picking up and trying to move forward to the next stage, and constantly reviewing and selecting those things. So there's a big piece of kind of applied research that we do where we see things that we think might have a defense and security application, and then start to invest and partner and kind of move them along the chain. And then as you get closer to applications, more into what I call the prototyping and the technology trialing and working with the end users, we do a bit of that as well. And maintaining that kind of pipeline across those three different phases, I think, is the way to achieve this. And the big questions and the really tough questions are around prioritization. And there's also a time element to it. So which ones do you pick? And it might be that you work on something for a number of years, and graphene's a good example there, where the promise is very high at the beginning, and then maybe you think, well, actually, maybe this is not moving quite as fast and isn't quite ready for prime time compared to something else what we might be doing. So you have to kind of do that continual reprioritization and shift your investment around, and have the right amount across the three kind of stages of the pipeline there. But there are, I'm super excited by some of the prospects around, quantum technology, moving more from science into engineering, where you see real devices that you can see a pathway to these being prototypes and into operational service, within our lifetimes, which I think is tremendously exciting. It'll change the world that we live in through quantum sensing, through quantum timing and navigation. It'll give us capabilities that were the sort of things that were, when I was a boy, science fiction and science fiction novels. And so I'm very optimistic, but the key word, I think, is prioritization. Continue to invest, trying many things, being accepting of the fact that not all will become winners, but out of the many will become few that get into real applications, products and services, and make dramatic steps forwards in our ability around defence and security.
Thanks, Gary. Dave, from your sort of academic background and then looking at what's out there in industry, how does that relationship between industry and the fundamental research operate? Does it operate well, do you think?
This is kind of an ideal question for me, it feels like, because as you alluded to, I started in academia in the UK back in the 1980s, and that was very much the theory. It was all computer science, and it was pretty much theoretical. The kinds of things I was working on so far have never become product. But then I moved from there into Fujitsu Laboratories, which is the industrial laboratory kind of thing, which to a large extent is still pretty pie in the sky, okay? And then more recently, like the last couple of years, I've moved over to the business unit and start to look more at that technology pull through and how do we pull things through. And you can see it happening in little surprising places. While you were talking, I was thinking there was something I wanted to talk about. I couldn't remember what it was. And then you said the carbon nanotubes technology. was something that we actually put a press release out just back in April, where we've taken carbon nanotubes and put glue on both sides of them. You can stick them down on something, and it's like an order of magnitude or 2 orders of magnitude faster at drawing heat off of an object than anything today. So if you think about, trying to cool something in a hostile environment, and now that's now coming out of industry. It's very theoretical. I mean, carbon nanotubes in towers and put into a flexible sheet that you can just stick on something to cool it. That kind of pull through is really exciting. And for me, I'm having more excitement now, okay, than I had for a long time in the labs, because I'm taking a different technology that is basically, we call it quantum inspired, and it's looking at the combinatorial optimization potential that quantum computing gives us. But we've gone back to the old traditional transistor and implemented a combinatorial optimization engine on a single chip that basically gives us a 10,000-fold boost over existing technology. And this is something that's sitting at TRL 7. Probably I won't say 8 except on a sales call. And it's a technology.
I hope the government starts taking note.
It's a technology that we know how to use today, but it needs integration. And again, back into, you need the information to feed into it. You need to understand the problem. What is the combinatorial optimization problem of a remote field deployment? Can you actually state what it is that the good looks like? And then figure out how to get there. And that's what this kind of stuff. So I've been really excited by that. So Simon, you said that it was the new and modern futuristic stuff that's exciting, but no, I think it's actually pulling it all together that's really exciting.
And perhaps I'll develop that a little bit, because we had a question in from Harry Lai from Global Defence Technology, and his question was actually around how do these modern technologies sit alongside conventional, what we would deem to be conventional today. I mean, they would have been unconventional 100 years ago, but they're conventional today. How does, where is the balance between the new and the sort of the old, as it were, or the established? And that, of course, is a massive, here in the UK, it's a very live question as we enter into a new round of defence review discussions, which will be around those prioritization, optimization questions. But where do you see that the sort of the balance lying between conventional technologies, if I can use that term, and the new? Or does it come back to what you were just saying, Dave? And it's a question of actually how we combine the two. Perhaps I'll come back to you, Dave, and then I'll ask the other two to contribute.
So the first thing is the combination is critical, and that will become more and more true as we simple things like applying artificial intelligence really needs to solve the data problem first, and so these things do have to be pulled together. The other thing that we can do is where you have technology like this quantum inspired, it uses the same algorithms that we're going to be using in 5 to 10 years, or maybe 10 to 20 years, on quantum computers. It does not perform like a quantum computer. No, not anywhere near that fast, but it does so at scale. And it does so using algorithms that we need to start thinking about how we understand them better today. And so a lot of what we're looking at should be using conventional technology to better understand how to use future technology. And so that there is a continuous process as well as a hybrid kind of integration.
And Gary, where would you see that? I mean, I understand there's going to be a whole process that's going to be gone through, but in general terms, this debate has been raging for possibly forever. Ever since man went from the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. But these tensions exist between existing technologies and new technologies. How do you see that unfolding?
Yeah, I think what Dave said is right on. It's not as kind of black and white, old and new. I mean, there's lots of conventional, in quotes, technologies that we have today. We're investing in military platforms that will be with us for the next 30, 40 years. And, they have extremely advanced technology on them already today, and they'll continue to evolve and be upgraded with, again, a mixture of conventional and new technologies. So I agree completely with the hybrid comment. It's how to harness a combination of things that we have on the shelf right now and things that are coming down the line. And I think also there's something around, just, execution and applying technologies. So if I think about, within the military space and what we're talking about at the moment, the use of data and communications, and every platform's a sensor. There's, to realize that vision of what we call information advantage it doesn't require actually an awful lot of new technology. It's actually the application and the integration of things that we already know how to do, but to do it in a much more kind of joined up and homogeneous way, and to have an architecture and so on. So there's much that can be done, and real actual significant breakthroughs that can come from the application and good execution around existing technologies. And then looking for, where I think new technologies enable you to make kind of a real step change or leapfrog or create something completely different than what you have today. And then in between, there's pulling through those new technologies and combining them with existing. So it's much more blurred around the edges and much more, again, complex, that word again, of figuring out how to apply a combination of what we know how to do today and what might be just maturing and coming down the pipeline.
And Bryan, how do you see it when you sort of aggregate this up to the NATO level? Because there is a total mix in the alliance in terms of the kind of force mix that's available, and actually combining that force mix with a sort of futuristic vision with a current vision is quite a challenge, I would expect.
Simon, you've hit the nail right on the head. This is an absolutely vital issue for the alliance. We're an alliance of 30 nations with diverse military capabilities. In alliance operations, we are likely to have non-allied partners as well. So the ability of different nations to come together with differing military capabilities but still perform the same alliance operation is absolutely vital for us. So we do spend a lot of our time thinking about interoperability and standardization. NATO has a very long history of working with the nations to produce standardizations, STANAGs as they are known technically, to allow the allies and their partners to interoperate with each other. And there's an important role for the NATO Science and Technology Organization in this, an important role for the nations. If the nations cooperate at the low TRL levels under the NATO Science and Technology banner, then we can work at the very earliest stages to make sure that we can be interoperable with the technologies that we are developing, to make sure that the nations are comfortable with the way that they can interoperate with each other right down at the basic low TRL level, so that as the technology matures and develops into fieldable capabilities, we're already on the case in terms of interoperating. And that also means not only the new technology can cooperate with the new technology, but we can assist the nations in the interoperating of new capabilities with existing ones. So this is an absolutely vital area for the alliance.
So this isn't a two-speed world; it's a multi-speed world that we're living through and trying to expedite.
Absolutely.
There are a couple of questions that we've had in from the people have asked us from the defence media. So Peter Felstead from Jane's Defence Weekly has asked a question around resource and the balance of resource, and we've already talked about priorities and how we choose those priorities. And Flavia Camargas from Shepherd Media has asked us a similar question, but in a different way, around NATO's priorities of S&T. Can I just ask where so perhaps I'll come first to you, Gary. Where do you think the priorities are going to lie in this coming decade in terms of S&T development? Or if you can't say exactly how it will, what's the process that you're going to go through to try and determine those winners that we're trying to spot?
Yeah, no, it's a great question, and if I think about resources, for me it starts with what's the supply of young scientists and engineers? It's got to start there, So how do we get a healthy supply of young people in the UK seeing science and engineering as an appealing sort of profession to move into, I think we have a very good, I'm quite optimistic on this front. I think we talk a lot about the challenges there, and young people are not choosing science and engineering compared with other alternatives, but I see a lot of young scientists, and we just hired probably about 600-700 people over the last 2 years, and they're predominantly younger people. And they're predominantly people who have not worked certainly in defence and security before. So I'm both concerned and optimistic at the same time, if that makes sense. And I think that's really important as a nation. We continue to promote and sort of reveal the kind of career that all of us actually have enjoyed through being close to science and technology, and get a healthy supply of young people coming through. And I think we should look across the disciplines, because there's exciting things happening in, synthetic biology and chemistry, through to, electronics and cyber and data science. So we should encourage a healthy supply of people coming through in all of those areas, and through the university system. And that'll ensure, I think, that we've got the right kind of skills that we need to apply to the many challenges, some of which we don't even know what they're going to be yet in the coming years ahead.
And Dave, if I come to you from a sort of an industry perspective, because to some extent industry and government are fishing in the same pond of talent, and that can introduce a mix of challenges. So how do you see that this prioritization exercise that we're going to have to go through, and also if you could pick up on Gary's point about actually it's the people that really matter, because that's where the ideas will come from. They're not going to come out of thin air; they come out of people.
Now, this is one of the things that really thrills me at the moment is that, having moved from the university into the labs and into industry, I've missed out on the young people while I was in the labs. We had relatively low turnover, smaller numbers of people to talk to. But now back into particularly in the Fujitsu part of the Fujitsu defense part of Fujitsu, we have a very good recruitment program around young science and technology people. That's true across the Fujitsu group, across all of Northwest Europe, which pretty much covers all of NATO. Everywhere in the corporation, we focus on providing an attractive package to science and technology people to come into the business, as well as a very good package for the business people, because we definitely do a lot of recruiting around consulting skills and so forth. So our graduate program then mixes all of these people together. And I think that kind of building a skill set says that people can come in, learn how to do both the technical and the engagement sides of life. In terms of the fishing in both ponds, that's actually an advantage if we both fish in the same pond, because it doesn't mean we have to stay there. It's easy to move back and forth much more now than it has been in the past. The idea, of a career in one particular part of the industry forever doesn't exist anymore. Young people are coming up anticipating 2 or 3 careers. And so being aware of that now in the way in which we deploy our internal resources, and we will encourage people and help them develop, knowing that will chase them out the door because they have a goal somewhere else. But chances are they'll go to a customer and then they might come back again. And this is all very healthy. And so a very positive attitude towards resource development, let's call it, okay? And it's a resource development that we need to work more collectively, because no matter where you put good people, they will come to benefit to you in the end.
And Bryan, looking at this across the alliance, so there's of course there's a transatlantic dimension to it. There's an intra-European dimension to it. There's an intra-European Union dimension to this, and I'm sort of touching on the change that Brexit will bring in terms of a the UK element. The UK is but one partner of but one member of NATO, but more broadly that international picture and the prioritization exercise, but also picking up on this question about the people and that vital human resource.
Yeah. Thanks. I like to think that the NATO Science and Technology Organization can help the nations, can help Gary and David build the body of young scientists. We offer international opportunities. We offer young scientists the ability to work with colleagues in different countries, different cultures, and so on. That's a very rich opportunity for young scientists to broaden their careers, as David says, to look at new opportunities that might come their way for jobs. We've got our own laboratory at La Spezia in Italy that has a very active young scientist program, and I know that a number of nations are particularly concerned about shortage of skills in some detailed underwater science, and we can help there. We can help. We bring young scientists together once a year at the level of the NATO Science and Technology Board for them to get some experience of the sort of opportunities that they can have if they wish to pursue scientific careers in their nations and link back into the international world. So rather like Gary said, I'm concerned but also optimistic, and I share Dave's point around that. But it's not only just government scientists that NATO Science and Technology uses. We do draw on industrial expertise. We do draw on academic expertise. Quite often, the people from industry and government can also be leaders of individual NATO Science and Technology projects. So again, there's great opportunities to build the young scientists and to give them opportunities in their other careers. Simon, you also touched on NATO-EU relations. We've got a very thriving relationship with the organs of the European Union. We've already touched on the fact that a lot of technological development now comes from the civil sector rather than defence, and we must remind ourselves just how strong the European Union is in funding civil defence. So we have rich discussions about the future direction of civil research and defence research. I mentioned NATO's own laboratory at La Spezia. That gets funding from the EU for certain specific projects, including the fledgling European defence research projects as well. So both at my level with my colleagues in the European Union and at specific research levels, there's a very thriving NATO-EU relationship there.
Thanks. Perhaps I'll circle back to come back to the sort of foundation of our discussion, which is about the science and the technology. I'm always conscious that in a lot of these discussions, and you mentioned it in your introduction, Bryan, and as did you, Gary, and you, Dave, that we look at the digital technology, the information, big data, AI, etc. And the thing that inspired me when I was at school and got me into studying science was the moon program. The NASA moonshot was underway. I'm that old. And also the Star Wars was there. And of course, in Star Wars, even in Star Wars, they didn't believe that they could do video telephone calls on a handheld device. The communicator was just a flip-up phone, and we've moved well on from the flip-up phone. We're well beyond the flip-up phone. But the other thing, so teleportation, which would overcome the need for vehicles, was the big thing that I suspect we're probably not going to have in the next decade. But the other thing that they did exploit greatly were energy weapons, and we've not touched on the sort of hard end of the business, if you like, in defence, which is actually doing violence to the enemy, but that element of, I know there's a lot of research, and one of the things which will almost guarantee to fill a theatre at any conference is a discussion on energy weapons. So perhaps I'll come to you first, Gary. You know, energy weapons, is the UK investing, interested? What direction do you see that, or is that a technology that's going to be one of those coming technologies rather than an arrived technology?
I think time will tell on that, but certainly there's been significant investment in energy weapons, in laser energy weapons in particular, and we've been very active on that for a number of years. And in fact, the UK has some actually very specialist expertise and capability to, particularly around the area of directed energy. And we're actually just at the point of moving with the first kind of demonstrators. So we have, container-sized demonstrators of directed energy weapons that we'll be trialing probably at the beginning of next year. And we're actually right now just tendering for industry to come and build the next generation prototypes that we'll seek to then use with military customers in land and sea in particular, and move it to the next stage of actually trying these weapons in operational scenarios. So, I mean, we've made significant progress, around targeting, around, getting enough energy on a target to do meaningful damage. We've solved largely both of those problems. And now the challenge is size, weight, and power. Getting a form factor that enables you to put them on a ship or on a tank, or in a land installation, within kind of a military operating environment. So something called Team HRSA, that's a collaboration between government and industry to actually let those contracts to build prototypes over the next couple of years, and by the middle of the decade, having something that is very close to being deployable for real operations. So this is one actually that's advancing at pace, and actually I'm quite optimistic that within this decade we're going to see some meaningful operational use of these types of novel weapons.
I mean, my purpose in sort of leading us down this alley was to draw us into a part of the discussion where, yes, many of the technologies that we've discussed they're crossovers from the civil sector, and as we've said, actually, many of these things will actually be developed in the civil sector. But there are within the context of defence some very defence-specific requirements. And Bryan, do you see that from a NATO perspective? Is NATO seeking to set within that, so those priorities, those specific areas that actually defence itself just needs to focus on, because the rest of industry and the rest of the community are not going to generate them because of what the ultimate purpose of them is?
Yeah. Simon, I'd like to make 2 points on this. First is, you're absolutely right. We do talk about the majority of technologies being drawn from the civil sector, but we won't see complex weapons, for example, coming from the civil sector. We won't see a lot of stealth coming from the civil sector. So there are some bespoke areas which are likely to remain the preserve of the defence sector, and for sure the NATO Science and Technology Organisation is looking at those, giving them the priority that the nations collectively decide that they want to work together under a NATO umbrella. So that's my first point. I entirely agree. There are some technologies that are clearly defence-specific technologies. The second area, picking up on Gary's point on directed energy weapons, NATO's interest there as a science and technology organisation is largely assisting countries like the UK and others who have maturing national programmes to be able to think through how they can be used in an alliance context when there will be other nations alongside them who may not have the same capability, and how those weapons can be used militarily effectively but safely for other alliance forces. So yes, we're very much on the case in these areas.
That's right. And Dave, I'm not going to ask you about directed energy weapons, but I'm going to sort of broaden the question out for you in terms of actually, you know, industry, an industry approach to those very defence-specific and defence-related questions, and elements of development, rather than those that come out of the broader developments that, you know. So I'm taking the defence and Fujitsu defence as a specific here. And it may not even be a relevant question for you. I'm sort of postulating it's how does industry relate to those specific demands that defence has?
So in general terms, industry will do both draw from the defense sector to create commercial activity and then contribute commercial solutions to specific targets. I'm not, at Fujitsu, we don't develop weaponry. That's not part of our remit at all, not with the Japanese baseline philosophy behind it. However, there are places where we've done demonstrations, even around potential for directed energy. The idea that we did in a demonstration last year was to deal with let's assume we know what's coming at us in a large swarm attack and we have an energy weapon. How do we prioritize that? Which targets do we start with? What are the solutions and algorithms that we can deploy there? And that's one of the places we test drove our quantum-inspired technology. And we're able to use the technology to demonstrate sequencing up to 200 targets within under a second. Now, that's the kind of support we can offer without actually being directly involved in the development of modern warfare.
My sort of reference to Star Wars and the moonshot was not just an idle introduction. It's also because that's the next dimension I want to go to in terms of you know, that space has now been recognized as a domain in its own right, alongside you know, maritime, land, air, and the sort of the cyberspace, the virtual space. How do you, Gary, from a space perspective, where do you see, with the arrival, the sort of the space strategy evolving in the UK, where do you see space in the next decade from a you know, UK science and technology perspective?
Yeah, this is certainly going to be one of the largest growing and rapidly growing areas in the UK. I mean, a number of things coming together, maybe with you know, Brexit, together with the miniaturization of small satellites able to do things that you couldn't have dreamed of a few years ago. Significant investment. We've grown our team significantly at DSTL in the area of space to really try to build a UK capability that's kind of, we've had a bit of a holiday on this for a few years, and we're trying to kind of restart that UK expertise for the defence application in particular. So very big investments, lots of people being hired to work in this space, both in terms of civil space, but you know, in military space as well. And actually, the only way we are going to be successful on this one is through allied, you know, and international partnerships, because it's so big and so expensive that no one country or very few countries can afford to do this alone. So we'll be investing a lot. There'll be some really exciting developments in this area, you know, over the next 5 to 10 years in terms of communications, in terms of surveillance and reconnaissance, in terms of, we even talk about space conflict. Again, that's emerging its head as well, and we have to kind of be alive to that in this world of global competition and global conflict. So lots and lots of areas there, and I'm really exciting actually the developments that I think we'll see in the next 5 to 10 years in that area.
And Bryan, so Gary gave you a natural segue in terms of actually, no one country can do this alone, and we're going to have to look to alliances and partners. Where does the alliance sit? Where you view it from in terms of the Science and Technology Board?
Yep. So, NATO formally recognised space as a domain a number of years ago, and the Science and Technology Organisation has been very much responding to that. The nations working together with each other and under a NATO banner. Gary is absolutely right. Nations can bring their own expertise and share it and draw on other nations' expertise, which may be in a slightly different area. One ally may bring a test capability for space that most other allies don't have. That can be shared. So it's an extremely powerful way of undertaking this vast amount of science in a very cost-effective way, but also in a very research-effective way as well. So we are working with the nations, with the United Kingdom and very many other allied nations and partner nations as well, to pool our expertise in this new and growing area. And like Gary, I'm very excited by what we can do in this domain.
And Dave, from where you sit in the forest, space as a priority, and where that integration of both terrestrial and space-based systems, where do you see the future?
Well, I think from a commercial point of view, the spatial domain is essential for commerce. Everything that we do now is built around our global communication systems, many of which rely on satellite systems. The whole operation of GPS, and therefore the fact that the defense sector has identified space as a domain that needs to be considered and protected is absolutely vital to maintaining a stable economic framework for everything else we do. And so space, in a sense of, yes, we have done satellites in the past, but it's been a very long time. One of my early bosses at the laboratories was a satellite scientist. But the level of activity around that is now mostly focused on the communications and understanding what is necessary for high performance, reliable, secure, if necessary, communications in the context of both with and without space, with EM disturbance, etc. So the vital area, but we don't build rockets either. So
I was hoping for a new story here, but it wasn't going to come.
I'll work on it. Maybe next time.
Perhaps I'm going to come to a very specific question, Bryan, which lies in your bailiwick. But actually, it's to give an area of NATO's work which actually doesn't necessarily see the shining light very often. So Dan Wasserby from Jane's International Defence Review has asked us around the NATO science programme and the Science for Peace and Security programme with partners, and what you see as its future. As he quite rightly says, actually, it doesn't really see the light of day very much and get much publicity. But it's probably one of these, like many of these efforts, it's quite a strong underpinning of what we require, as we've touched on throughout this conversation about the need for cooperation and collaboration throughout.
Simon, thank you. So I'll take a step back and talk a little bit about NATO science and technology. Most of that is done in my organisation, the NATO Science and Technology Organisation, which has an office in the Brussels headquarters. It also has an office in Paris, which runs our collaborative programme of work. And we have our own laboratory, the Centre for Maritime Research and Experimentation at La Spezia in Italy. My office is principally the provision of advice to NATO leadership and the administration of our Science and Technology Board. Paris runs or administrates the collaborative programme of work, £300 million a year, roughly 300 projects at any one time. And the Centre for Maritime Research and Experimentation has its own world-class research vessels and is also a globally acknowledged centre of excellence on maritime autonomy. In terms of the science we do, our programme of work can comprise of conferences, research, test and evaluation, and exchanges of papers and so on. It's a real sharing of expertise to take research forward. Roughly 2/3 of our research is currently directed towards disruptive technologies, precisely the sorts of technologies that we have been talking about in this morning. It's not the only body in NATO that does science and technology, although it is the largest. There is also a Science for Peace and Security programme, which focuses on doing science between NATO allies and non-NATO allies. We've got a Defence Against Terrorism programme. We've also got an innovation hub at NATO's Allied Command Transformation in Norfolk, Virginia. And my job as Chief Scientist includes making sure that we have good visibility of each other's programs and that we agree on the overall priorities and the overall strategy. There is a NATO Science and Technology strategy, and the download is available as part of the package of this video conference. So many organizations are involved because science underpins defense. And NATO leadership look to me as the chief scientist to make sure that it's properly joined up. We've got a thriving future. The nations continue to want to work under the NATO Science and Technology Organization. We've touched on the sort of benefits that there are of doing that, and I'm very confident that we can continue to assist the nations in taking their own defence science and technology forward.
Thanks, Bryan. And your mention of the Innovation Fund, Innovation Hub, brought to mind the fact that in the UK, there's also a lot of effort that's gone in with the Defence Innovation Fund, etc. I mean, Gary, could you just say maybe just a few words about how you see that developing over the next few years? And I realise that actually that the responsibility for that actually lies very much within the centre, as it were, in the Ministry of Defence, but you are an active participant with that programme. So just a few words, if you would.
Yeah, we're involved in the delivery of a lot of those programmes, and it's an area where I think defence fully recognises, you know, the shift that we've talked about a little bit between inventing technology more towards harnessing technology that got developed in the commercial sector, and the innovation funding is around trying to bring that commercially developed technology and apply it to defence problems. So there's wide recognition that there's been some funding in that area, but it's not enough, and we need to do much more of that. And it's this tension between the new and the emerging technologies versus the more traditional. So they're certainly very current this year as we look up to a spending review and an integrated review in the autumn, talking a lot about the balance of money that we put into in-house government developed research and, you know, innovation, the pull through of technologies developed in the private sector. So yeah, it's a really challenging, because it's all about prioritization of not enough money to do everything, essentially. But it goes much beyond that, actually, because it affects, it's not just about the money in the programs, it affects the processes that we use. It affects the culture that we have, how we think about safety and regulation, how we do training, how we do through life support. So while we focus on the funding of the programs, the exciting technology, actually it touches just about every single part of, you know, bringing something into capability and supporting it through the entire life cycle. And you know, it's interesting because new technologies often have a habit of just changing all of the processes and the ways of working. You know, I mean, you can see that throughout history. So you know, the funding and investment in this area is vital, not only to bring those new technologies to bear, but to drive, you know, agile and, you know, moving away from waterfall development into iterative development and all of these new ways of working. It affects procurement, it affects the way we think about safety and risk. And so it's vitally important on many fronts beyond just the technology aspect of it.
Well, thanks very much, Gary. That's probably a sort of an almost ideal point to draw our conversation to a close, because we've sort of circled back around in a way to where we started, which is it's not about a single technology. It's about the integration of technologies and the integration of technologies with organizations and behaviors. And I'm always reminded when I walk around something like DSEI that, you know, that enormous collection, a quite eclectic collection of technologies under one roof and alongside one wharf, that in the history of innovation, that some of the commentators say that actually the innovation doesn't spring out of a bathtub, a sort of Archimedean bathtub. You know, Archimedes didn't jump out of the bath with his eureka moment. It came from a whole series of things that suggested to him and foundations, and they are all to do with recognizing adjacent possibilities. And I think in this morning's conversation, we've been through a number of adjacent possibilities. You know, when we were talking about quantum, I was very struck, Dave, that, you know, that notion that it may not be quantum computing that's actually going to be the thing that's going to change us. That's going to change most quickly. It's all those other technologies, and you, Gary, were saying that you can already see those quantum sensing technologies coming through, and these are things that actually for many of us they're still the stuff of science fiction, and so I think there's a lot here, but we can only touch on these things lightly in this kind of conversation, whereas actually in 431 days time, when we all get together over a beer, or maybe a cup of tea if you're teetotal, you know, whatever our favorite is, actually that ability as humans to get together and interact and recognize those adjacent possibilities is absolutely vital. So thank you very much for joining us today and sharing your thoughts and being so open in the discussion. I know we've gone all the way around in terms of the sort of quite big canvas that I laid out, and we probably haven't done any justice in terms of the detail that the audience would really want. But I hope it's given them some adjacent possibilities and some thoughts and ideas that'll cue for the future and cue us for the future. So thank you very much indeed for your time. It's been a great pleasure to have had this conversation with you. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you.